The mountains of Colorado do not care about your intentions or your faith. They are ancient monoliths of granite and ice that have watched civilizations rise and crumble into the dust of the canyons. When you walk into the high country of the Rocky Mountain National Park, you are stepping into a cathedral that was built long before the first human scream echoed through the timber. It is a place of staggering beauty, but it is also a place of profound and indifferent hunger. I have spent decades looking into the files of the vanished, and the one thing that stays with me is how quickly the world can simply turn its back on you. One moment you are part of a group, and the next you are a ghost, haunting the very ground you stood upon. It was the 2nd of October in the year 1999. The air in the Big Thompson Canyon was sharp and carried the scent of coming winter and curing pine needles. A group of 11 adults from a Christian singles organization had gathered for a weekend of fellowship and hiking. Among them was Jaryd Atadero and his 2 children. One of those children was a 3-year-old boy named Jaryd. He was a vibrant child with a mop of hair and a spirit that seemed too large for his small frame. He was wearing a light blue pullover sweater and matching pants, and his little sneakers were ready for the trail that led toward the Comanche Peak Wilderness. The group began their ascent on the Big South Trail around 11:30 in the morning. The trail follows the river, and it is a path flanked by dense thickets of willow and towering ponderosa pines. Jaryd was full of energy, and he was doing what children do when they feel the freedom of the open air. He was running ahead, and then back to the group, and then ahead again. He was playing a game of distance with the adults who were moving at a much slower pace. 2 of the hikers in the group were roughly 100 feet ahead of the main body of people. Jaryd ran up to them and asked if there were bears in the woods. They laughed and told him that there might be, but he was safe. The boy then ran further ahead of those 2 lead hikers. He rounded a bend in the trail and vanished from their sight for just a few seconds. The hikers assumed he was just hiding or waiting for them around the next outcropping of rock. But when they rounded that same bend less than a minute later, the trail was empty. The dirt was undisturbed and the silence of the forest had swallowed the sound of his small footsteps. There was no cry for help and no sound of a struggle. There was only the wind moving through the needles of the trees and the distant rush of the river. Jaryd Atadero was gone. The initial confusion turned into a cold and sharpening panic within minutes. The members of the group began shouting his name, and their voices bounced off the canyon walls in a frantic rhythm. They searched the immediate area and checked the riverbanks and looked behind every fallen log. But the boy was nowhere to be found. By the time the sun began to dip behind the peaks, the local authorities had been notified. This was not a typical lost person case. This was a child who had disappeared in a window of time that was less than 60 seconds long. It is a recurring theme in these files, where the victim is separated by a distance that should be easily covered by a human voice, but they are never heard from again. The search that followed was one of the largest in the history of the park. More than 50 search and rescue personnel were on the ground by the following morning. They brought in bloodhounds and tracking dogs and helicopters equipped with thermal imaging. They combed every square inch of the trail and the surrounding brush. The dogs were the most troubling part of the early investigation. These were highly trained animals capable of picking up a scent days old. Yet when they were brought to the spot where Jaryd was last seen, they were unable to pick up a trail. One dog simply sat down and refused to move, while others paced in circles as if the scent had been lifted straight up into the air. The weather in the Rockies is a volatile beast. On the 3rd day of the search, a massive storm system rolled over the Continental Divide. The temperature plummeted, and the rain turned into a blinding heavy snow. This is another chilling commonality in these disappearances. Just as the search reaches its peak intensity, the environment itself seems to conspire to shut it down. The snow covered the ground and obscured any tracks that might have remained. The searchers were forced to retreat for their own safety. Jaryd Atadero stood at the trailhead and watched the white curtain fall over the mountain where his son was lost. He was a man broken by the impossible physics of the situation. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. The case went cold, but it never left the minds of those who were there. There were theories, of course. Some suggested a mountain lion had snatched the boy, but a mountain lion is a messy killer. They leave blood, and they leave a trail of broken brush, and they certainly do not snatch a child within earshot of 11 adults without making a sound. Others thought he might have fallen into the river, but the river had been searched extensively and his small body never surfaced downstream. The mystery of Jaryd Atadero became a dark legend in the park. A story told to remind people that the woods are not a playground. Then came the year 2003. It had been nearly 4 years since the boy vanished. Two hikers were traveling off-trail in a rugged and steep area about 550 feet above the original trail where Jaryd had disappeared. This was not a place a 3-year-old could have reached on his own. The terrain was a brutal incline of sliding scree and jagged rock faces. As the hikers navigated a narrow ledge, they looked down and saw something that did not belong in the natural world. It was a patch of faded blue fabric. They moved closer and realized they were looking at a small pullover sweater and a pair of pants. The clothing was remarkably well preserved, despite 4 years of exposure to the elements. But the way the clothes were found was what chilled the investigators to the bone. The sweater was found inside out. There was no blood on it. There were no tears from teeth or claws that would indicate a predator attack. Nearby, they found a single small sneaker. It was still tied. Inside the sneaker, there was no foot. Later, searchers found a small fragment of a skull and a single tooth. The rest of the boy was gone. There were no other bones found in the immediate vicinity. No femurs and no ribs and no pelvis. Just a fragment of the head and the empty clothes. The location of the remains defied all logic. For a 3-year-old to reach that height, he would have had to hike over 2 miles from the point of disappearance and climb a vertical elevation that would challenge an experienced adult hiker. He would have had to do this while avoiding the hundreds of searchers who were combing the area in the days after he went missing. If he had been taken by a predator like a mountain lion, the clothes would have been shredded and scattered. Instead, they were found in a neat pile, as if they had been removed by human hands. But why would a child remove his clothes in the freezing cold, and why was the sweater inside out? There are things in the deep woods that we do not have names for yet. There is a phenomenon where people are found in locations that are physically impossible for them to reach. We see it time and again in these high-altitude cases. The silence that precedes the disappearance, and the failure of the tracking dogs, and the sudden onset of bad weather are all hallmarks of something predatory but not animal. It is as if the fabric of reality thins in certain places, and things are allowed to pass through. Jaryd Atadero did not just wander off. He was moved by a force that left no footprint and no scent, and no evidence of its passing. The official report eventually concluded that a mountain lion was the most likely culprit despite the lack of evidence supporting a predatory strike. It is the easy answer. It is the answer that allows the Park Service to keep the trails open and the tourists coming. But the people who were there know better. They know that a mountain lion does not undress its prey. They know that a mountain lion does not carry a child 500 feet up a cliff face without leaving a single drop of blood or a tuft of hair. They are left with the image of those empty blue clothes sitting on a high ledge overlooking the valley where the searchers had looked for so long. The story of Jaryd Atadero remains an open wound in the history of the Colorado wilderness. It is a reminder that the boundary between our world and the unknown is much thinner than we care to admit. We like to think that GPS and cell phones and modern technology have made us safe, but they are just toys in the face of a primal and ancient power. When you go into the mountains, you are an intruder. You are a guest in a house that does not want you there. And sometimes the house decides to keep a souvenir. This case is not an isolated incident. In the year 1958, a boy named Bobby Bizup disappeared from a camp in the very same Rocky Mountain National Park. He was 10 years old and he vanished while walking a short distance between a cabin and a river. Just like Jaryd, his remains were found years later at an incredible altitude on a steep slope that he could not have climbed. The same patterns of impossible travel and missing clothing repeat themselves across the decades. We see it in the case of Keith Parkins, who vanished in Nevada and was found miles away over a mountain range in a time frame that defied human capability. The patterns are there for those who are willing to look into the darkness and realize that we are not always at the top of the food chain. Sleep well tonight, and if you hear a voice calling your name from the timber, do not go toward it. The mountains are listening. The air up there does not just get thin, it gets hungry. You can feel it in the back of your throat, a dry metallic rasp that tastes like old pennies and frozen granite. We tell ourselves that the wilderness is a playground, a place to find our souls among the pines and the rushing water, but the mountains do not care about your soul. They care about the weight of your bones and the heat in your blood. When Jaryd Atadero went missing in the Comanche Peaks wilderness back in October of 1999, the world was focused on the turn of the millennium and the fear of digital collapse. But in the shadows of the Big South Trail, a much older and more terrifying collapse was taking place. A 3-year-old boy does not just vanish into the ether without a sound, and yet that is exactly what happened while his father and a group of friends were only a few dozen yards away. The trail was supposed to be easy, a simple walk through the beauty of the Colorado autumn. The group had stopped to talk to some fishermen, and in that brief window of human distraction the silence of the woods closed in like a heavy curtain. There were no screams. There was no sound of a struggle or the frantic padding of a predator's paws on the dry earth. There was only the sudden, violent realization that the space where a child had been standing was now occupied by nothing but cold mountain air. You have to understand the density of that silence to truly appreciate the horror of it. It is a thick, suffocating thing that seems to dampen the very frequency of life. The searchers came by the hundreds, their boots churning the dirt into a fine powder that coated their lungs and their gear, but they found nothing for years. When the remains were finally discovered 4 years later, they were not in a valley or tucked into a thicket where a lost child might crawl for warmth. They were perched on a high, treacherous ledge 550 feet above the trail where he had last been seen. To reach that spot, a 3-year-old would have had to navigate a vertical rise of nearly 60 degrees, scrambling over jagged rocks and through dense, thorny brush that would have shredded delicate skin. Yet, the official story leaned on the tired trope of a mountain lion, a convenient ghost to haunt the papers and satisfy the lawyers. They told the public that a big cat had snatched the boy and carried him up that cliff face. But big cats are messy eaters. They leave tracks, they leave hair, and they certainly leave blood when they are hauling 60 pounds of struggling prey up a near vertical wall of stone. The physical evidence told a story that the authorities were too afraid to whisper in the light of day. When the searchers finally looked upon that high ledge, they found Jaryd's clothing. His red fleece sweatshirt and his little blue pants were sitting there weathered by the sun and the snow, but they were not torn to ribbons. They were not soaked in the dark rust-colored stains of a predatory kill. In fact, the most chilling detail was the shoes. The boy's tiny sneakers were found sitting side by side, his socks still tucked neatly inside them. If a mountain lion had taken that child, it would have had to possess the dexterity of a surgeon and the patience of a saint to undress him so carefully before consuming him. Nature does not work that way. Nature is jagged and cruel and efficient. What happened on that ledge was something else entirely. There is a specific kind of cold that settles into your marrow when you realize the geography of these cases makes no sense. The sheer physical exertion required to move a body to these high-altitude locations defies our understanding of human or animal capability. We are talking about miles of distance and thousands of feet of elevation gain achieved in windows of time that would challenge an Olympic athlete. It is as if the laws of friction and gravity are suspended for a few moments, allowing something to move through the forest with a terrifying silent fluidity. We see this pattern over and over. The victims are taken from groups, often in the blink of an eye, and they are found in places that they could not have reached on their own. It suggests a predator that does not hunt for meat, but perhaps for something far more ethereal and difficult to quantify. The mountain lion theory is a safety blanket for the soul. It allows people to go back to their tents and their campers believing that if they just carry a knife or a can of bear spray, they are the masters of their own destiny. But a bear spray canister will not save you from a force that can pull you out of time and space. The search dogs in the Atadero case were some of the best in the country, trained to find a scent in the middle of a hurricane. Yet they could not find a single trail to follow. They paced in circles, their tails tucked between their legs, whining at a void that only they could sense. When the dogs fail, you know you are not dealing with a creature of flesh and bone. You are dealing with something that leaves no biological footprint in our reality. Consider the case of Bobby Bizup in 1958. He was 10 years old, staying at a Catholic camp in the same rugged stretch of the Rocky Mountains. One afternoon, he set out to walk a short distance from the camp's main cabin to the river to do some fishing. It was a path, he knew, a path that was visible from the porch, and yet he simply dissolved into the landscape. The search was massive, involving the Air Force, the National Guard, and hundreds of volunteers who combed every square inch of that terrain. They found nothing. No fishing pole, no hat, no footprints in the soft mud near the water. It was as if Bobby had been plucked from the earth by a giant hand that left no mark on the world below. 1 year later, a hiker found Bobby's remains on a steep wind-swept ridge nearly 2,000 feet above the camp. Just like Jaryd, his clothing was found in a state that defied the elements and the logic of a predatory attack. The official word was that he had wandered off and succumbed to the elements, but that explanation ignores the impossible climb a 10-year-old would have had to make in the middle of a mountain storm. There is a heavy, a leaden feeling that comes over you when you look at the maps and see the lines where these boys disappeared. The distances are too great. The terrain is too hostile. And the silence that follows their departure is too absolute to be anything other than intentional. In the case of Keith Parkins, a 2-year-old boy who vanished from his grandfather's ranch in Nevada, the anomaly becomes even more pronounced. Keith was found 19 hours after he disappeared, nearly 12 miles away from the point of his disappearance. Between the ranch and the location where he was found lay a mountain range and miles of treacherous high desert terrain. A 2-year-old cannot walk 12 miles in 19 hours, especially not in the dark and over a mountain. To achieve that feat, he would have had to maintain a pace that is physically impossible for a toddler. When he was found, he was in a state of shock, his clothes torn, but his body largely unharmed, as if he had been transported by something that didn't care about the brush or the thorns. These are not accidents. They are not the result of poor parenting or lack of preparation. They are the result of a predatory phenomenon that operates on the periphery of our perception. We call it the wilderness, because we have no other word for the places where our rules no longer apply. In these high-altitude zones, the air is thick with more than just cold. There is a sense of being watched by eyes that do not reflect the light. There is a feeling that the trees are not just trees, but sentinels guarding a boundary that we cross at our own peril. When the weather turns, suddenly bringing in a wall of white fog or a sudden localized storm, it is often a precursor to the vanishing. It is as if the atmosphere itself is being manipulated to hide the movement of something large and ancient. We live in an age where we think we have mapped every corner of the globe, where satellites can see the brand of a cigarette butt on a sidewalk. But the mountains have a way of folding in on themselves. They have pockets of space that the cameras cannot see and the GPS cannot track. In those pockets, the old things still dwell. They are the things that the indigenous tribes warned us about for centuries, the spirits of the stone and the wind that demand a price for our intrusion. We have traded their ancient warnings for modern comfort, and in doing so, we have made ourselves vulnerable. We go into the woods with our bright-colored gear and our digital maps thinking we are safe, but we are just neon signs flashing in the dark for something that has been hunting here since the glaciers retreated. The official reports will always choose the simplest path. They will blame the cats, the bears, or the weather. They have to. If they admitted that people were being taken by something they couldn't explain, the parks would empty and the revenue would dry up. They would have to acknowledge that there are places in this country where the government has no control, where the laws of man and the laws of physics are equally irrelevant. So they file the reports and they bury the clothes in evidence lockers, and they hope that the public doesn't start connecting the dots. They hope you don't notice that the same stories are being told in the 1950s, the 1990s, and today. But the dots are there, and they form a picture that is too gruesome to ignore. It is a picture of a landscape that is alive and hostile. It is a picture of children being moved like chess pieces across a board they cannot see. Every time a search dog refuses to track, every time a child is found miles away in an impossible location, every time the clothing is found neatly folded or missing entirely, the pattern reinforces itself. It is a pattern of abduction by something that does not leave a scent. It is a pattern of travel that ignores the limitations of the human body. It is a pattern of silence that precedes a tragedy. I have spent years looking into these cases, and the weariness I feel is not just from the long hours of research. It is a spiritual fatigue that comes from staring into a void that never blinks. You start to see the woods differently after a while. You stop seeing the beauty of the pines and start seeing the shadows between them. You stop hearing the music of the wind and start hearing the way it masks the sound of approaching footsteps. The mountains are not our friends. They are a vast, uncaring cathedral of stone, and we are just the insects crawling across the altar. Sometimes the priest of that cathedral decides it is time for a sacrifice. Jaryd Atadero, Bobby Bizup, Keith Parkins. These names are just a few in a list that stretches back as far as we have kept records. The locations change, the decades pass, but the mechanics of the disappearance remain chillingly consistent. We are dealing with a predator that understands our psychology better than we understand its biology. It knows how to wait for the moment of distraction. It knows how to use the terrain to its advantage. And most importantly, it knows how to disappear without a trace, leaving us to argue over mountain lions and hypothermia while it retreats back into the high, silent places where we cannot follow. If you find yourself on a trail this weekend and the air suddenly turns cold despite the sun, pay attention. If the birds stop singing and the insects go quiet, do not wait to see what happens next. Turn around and walk back the way you came. Do not stop to look at the view. Do not stop to take a photograph of the strange shimmering light in the trees. There are things in those mountains that have been there since the earth was young, and they do not like to be disturbed. They are the masters of the high country, and they are always looking for a new souvenir to keep on a high, lonely ledge. The story of Jaryd Atadero is a tragedy, but it is also a warning. It tells us that the world is much larger and more terrifying than we want to believe. It tells us that our technology is a thin shield against a primal power. When you look up at the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, remember that they are not just scenery. They are the walls of a house that does not want you as a guest. The silence you hear when you reach the summit is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of something holding its breath, waiting for you to look away. We like to think we are at the top of the food chain because we have paved the roads and built the cities. But the moment you step off that pavement and into the timber, the rules change. You are back in the world of the hunter and the hunted. And in that world, the things that move without a sound and leave no tracks are the ones who truly rule. Sleep well tonight, and if you feel a sudden inexplicable chill in a room with no draft, perhaps it is just a reminder that the mountains are never as far away as they seem. The mountains are listening, and they have a very long memory. The patterns of the Atadero and Bizup cases are echoed in the disappearance of young Danny Philippides in 2018. He vanished from a ski resort in New York and was found 6 days later in California, confused and wearing the same ski gear with no memory of how he traveled nearly 3,000 miles. These impossible journeys and the strange state of the victims upon their discovery suggest a phenomenon that operates outside of our traditional understanding of geography and transit. Whether it is a physical displacement through a rift in reality or an abduction by a force with advanced capabilities, the result is the same. People are taken, moved, and sometimes returned in ways that should be impossible. The darkness in the woods is not just a lack of light. It is a presence all its own.